The door to Cyrus Carson's cabin burst open with a force that made the iron hinges scream, and the woman standing in the threshold was not what he expected to find on the worst night of the year. She was not asking for help. That was the first thing he noticed. She was bleeding from a gash along her left temple, her dark hair plastered to her face by the howling snow, and her green eyes were blazing with a fury so concentrated it nearly took the breath from his lungs. She had a Remington rolling block rifle gripped in both hands, muzzle pointed at the floorboards, and she was scanning his cabin the way a soldier scans a battlefield, not the way a frightened woman scans a stranger's home. "Are you alone?" she demanded. Not a whisper, not a plea, a command. Cyrus set down the coffee cup he had been holding and stood to his full 6'2", and even then something about this woman made the room feel like hers. "Last I checked," he said. "Last I checked is not good enough." She stepped inside, drove the door shut behind her with her boot, and swept the single-room cabin with those sharp green eyes before her shoulders dropped by exactly 1/4 of an inch. The smallest concession to relief he had ever witnessed. "3 men followed me from Ridgecrest. I lost them in the tree line about a mile out, but the storm will confuse tracks in both directions. If they find this cabin, they will not knock." Cyrus stood very still. Outside, the blizzard shrieked like something wounded, and the darkness beyond the frost-edged windows was absolute. The year was 1882. The Wyoming Territory was a frozen and lawless place in December, and this woman, bleeding and snow-covered and fierce, had just walked into the center of his life like a bullet that had been traveling toward him for years without his knowing it. He did not know her name yet. He did not know that she would change everything. He did not know that in 4 months he would be standing in front of a preacher with his heart so full he could barely speak his own name. All he knew in that moment was that the blizzard was the worst of the season, that 3 dangerous men were somewhere in the darkness beyond his walls, and that a woman with blood on her face and a rifle in her hands was looking at him like she was deciding whether he was an asset or a liability. He grabbed his coat from the peg by the door. "I will check the perimeter," he said. For the first time, something shifted behind those green eyes. Not softness, not gratitude, something closer to reassessment. "You will need a second lantern," she said. "Wind will kill the first one inside of 30 seconds. He paused. "I know." "Then you would know that going alone in a perimeter sweep during a whiteout is a good way to die for nothing." He turned to look at her fully. "You got a better plan." She set the Remington against the wall with the practiced ease of someone who had been handling firearms since before she was tall enough to see over a fence post. "I have a better plan," she said. "Sit down. Let me think." That was the moment, though he would not understand it until much later, when Cyrus Carson's fate was sealed. He sat down. 3 weeks earlier, Evelyn Aldridge had stepped off a stagecoach in the town of Ridgecrest, Wyoming, with 2 trunks, a rifle case, and a letter of recommendation from the United States Geological Survey office in Denver, Colorado. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a naturalist father who had dragged her across 5 territories, and the granddaughter of a cartographer who had never once asked whether a woman was capable of reading a compass. She had grown up believing that capability was the only currency that mattered, and she had spent her adult life proving it in the most concrete terms possible. She was a surveyor. Not the kind that stood at the edge of a field and made vague approximations. She was a precision surveyor, trained under her father and then formally certified by the survey office, capable of running a theodolite with absolute accuracy, calculating land elevations to the fraction of an inch, and producing maps that were used by railroad companies, territorial land offices, and the federal government itself. She was, by any objective measure, one of the finest survey practitioners in the Western Territories, and she was also a woman in 1882, which meant that every job she had ever taken had involved proving herself 3 times over before anyone believed what was already written on her credentials. The job that had brought her to Ridgecrest was a survey commission for a proposed railroad spur line through the canyon country north of town. The Northern Pacific had money invested in getting the route correct. A man named Arthur Pruitt, who operated out of Ridgecrest and controlled most of the land claims in the Northern Canyon District, stood to lose a great deal if the survey came back showing that the most efficient route ran through land he did not own. And Evelyn had done her preliminary calculations on the stagecoach ride-in, based on the topographical notes the previous surveyor had started before quitting without explanation, and she already suspected the previous surveyor had not quit so much as been persuaded to quit. She had met Arthur Pruitt on her second day in Ridgecrest, in the lobby of the boarding house where she was staying. He was a broad man with small eyes and the particular kind of smile that men use when they are certain they hold all the cards. He had offered her money to file a false report before she had even begun the actual survey. She had smiled back at him with the full and genuine warmth of someone who has just been handed exactly the evidence they needed, declined politely, and immediately sent a letter to her contact at the survey office informing him that there was corruption in the Ridgecrest district. That letter had put her in danger. She knew it as soon as she handed it to the post office clerk. She was operating in a town where Arthur Pruitt's influence ran deep, and she had just made herself the obstacle between him and a considerable fortune. On the evening of December the 3rd, 1882, the first blizzard of the season rolled in from the north like a wall of white fury, dropping temperatures to 20 below and reducing visibility to less than 10 yards. Evelyn had been returning from a preliminary site visit to the North Canyon Road when she noticed she was being followed. She had 3 men on her trail within 200 yards, and they were not making any effort at subtlety, which told her they were not trying to frighten her away. They were trying to finish the matter cleanly. She ran. She was not ashamed of that. Running from 3 armed men in a blizzard was not cowardice. It was mathematics. She ran north into the tree line, used the darkness and the storm as cover, and navigated by the topographical memory she had been building for 3 days. She knew the canyon country north of Ridgecrest better than men who had lived there for a decade, because she had been paying that specific kind of attention that only surveyors and the deeply curious ever pay. She found Cyrus Carson's cabin because she had noted it in her survey logs 3 days prior as a landmark reference point. She had written down its approximate coordinates. She had thought, in the detached professional way she thought about most things, that it was well positioned relative to the canyon geography, protected from north wind by a limestone ridge, with sight lines in 3 directions. She had not thought she would need it as a refuge. She had not thought she would find a man inside it who sat down when she told him to sit down, which in her experience was rarer than any geological feature she had ever mapped. Cyrus Carson was 32 years old and had been living in the canyon country north of Ridgecrest for 6 years. He had come to Wyoming from Texas with nothing more than a horse, a saddle, and the kind of silence that settles into a man who has lost things he cannot name. He had built the cabin himself, run a small cattle operation on the land he had claimed, and lived with a steadiness that some men called stubbornness and that he called peace. He was not a man who asked for more than he had. He was not a man who got lonely in any way that he would admit to himself. He had thick brown hair that curled slightly at the collar, hands that were rough from honest work, and dark eyes that people in Ridgecrest described as quiet, which meant they made people nervous in a way they could not quite explain. He was known in town as reliable. He settled his accounts. He kept his word. He was not known as warm, because warmth requires a certain opening of self that Cyrus had stopped practicing years ago, after a betrayal so complete it had restructured his understanding of what other people were capable of. He had been engaged once to a woman named Clara. She had left with his business partner, Thomas Hale, and taken with her the deed to the original ranch property that Cyrus had signed over to both their names in a gesture of trust so absolute and so naive that thinking about it still made something lock tight in his chest. He had rebuilt from nothing. He had come north to Wyoming and started again. He had built something solid and solitary and entirely his own, and he had decided, quietly and without drama, that solitude was preferable to the particular destruction that came with trusting someone completely. He had been wrong about a lot of things in his life. He was about to discover just how thoroughly wrong he had been about solitude. On the night Evelyn Aldridge walked into his cabin, Cyrus sat down at her instruction and watched her think. She stood in the center of his room, dripping snowmelt onto his floorboards, pressing one hand briefly against the gash on her temple, and then pulling it away to examine the blood with the same clinical interest she might give to a soil sample. She looked at his door, his windows, his fireplace, his rifle above the mantel, his layout of furniture, and then at him in that order. "How many firearms do you have in this structure?" she asked. "2 rifles, 1 revolver. Ammunition. Enough." "That is not an answer I can work with," she said, without heat, purely practical. 40 rounds for the Winchesters, 20 for the Colt." She nodded. "The 3 men following me will not brave the storm indefinitely. The blizzard is your best defense tonight, not ammunition. If they are smart, they will shelter and come back in daylight." She looked at him. "If they are not smart, they will try the cabin tonight and the storm will handle them before they reach the door." Cyrus studied her. "You have done this before. Been followed by dangerous men, more than I would prefer." She finally unbelted her coat, and he saw beneath it the practical clothing of a working woman who spent her days outdoors. Heavy canvas trousers, a wool shirt, boots that were built for terrain and not for town. She hung the coat on the peg beside his and crossed to the fire as naturally as if she had been doing it for years. "I have not been introduced," she said, holding her hands toward the flames. "My name is Evelyn Aldridge. I am a surveyor, contracted by the United States Geological Survey to map the Northern Canyon District for a proposed railroad route. The men following me work for Arthur Prewitt, who does not want an accurate map filed." "Cyrus Carson," he said. "I run cattle on the land north of your canyon district." She turned to look at him then, and something in her expression shifted. "Carson. Your eastern boundary would intersect my survey grid at approximately mile marker 14. He blinked. "How do you know that?" "I have been building a mental map of this district for 3 days. Your cabin is in my survey notes as a landmark reference." She turned back to the fire. "I did not plan to use it as a refuge, but I am glad it existed." He stood up slowly, the way a man stands when he is deciding something. "How bad is the cut on your head?" "It needs cleaning." "It does not need stitching." "You sure about that?" She touched it again. 4 years ago, I sutured a cut on my own forearm with a sewing needle and silk thread after a fall in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. I am qualified to assess whether this one requires the same treatment. It does not." The absolute matter-of-fact quality of that statement landed in Cyrus's chest like a stone dropped into still water. He went to his medicine kit, brought her the carbolic and a clean cloth, and set them on the table beside her without comment. She cleaned the wound herself efficiently, without flinching, and he stood back and watched her and felt something unfamiliar turning over in him. Not desire exactly, though she was striking, with her dark hair and her sharp face and those extraordinary green eyes. It was something more unsettling than desire. It was the particular vertigo of recognizing that you are in the presence of someone who is operating at a level that commands not admiration from a distance but actual, personal, restructuring respect. He was a capable man. He knew he was capable. He had built a life with his hands in hard country, and he did not doubt his own competence in the terrain he inhabited. But this woman was capable in a way that was both different from and parallel to his own, and the combination of the two, the physical toughness and the precision intelligence, was something he had genuinely never encountered before. He put on coffee. It seemed like the right thing to do. "Tell me about Prewitt," he said. She did. She told him cleanly and without embellishment, the way someone tells a story when they are giving information rather than seeking sympathy. She described the commission, the preliminary calculations, the meeting in the boarding house lobby, the letter she had sent, and the 3 men who had appeared behind her on the canyon road. When she finished, Cyrus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know Prewitt." She looked at him. He tried to buy my eastern pasture land 2 years ago. Land that sits on the canyon approach. I told him no. He paused. He sent a man out to the cattle operation twice after that. Nothing came of it, but the implication was clear enough. He is not accustomed to being refused, she said. No. He will try again. Yes. They looked at each other across the firelit cabin with the blizzard howling outside, and something passed between them that was not quite understood by either of them yet. It was the recognition of two people who have both been fighting similar battles alone, and who are only now, improbably, in the same room. Cyrus made her sleep in his bunk that night and rolled himself onto the floor by the fire with his Colt at his hand. He did not sleep well, but not because of the men in the storm. He lay awake listening to the blizzard ease by 2 in the morning, and he thought about a woman who sutured her own wounds in mountain wilderness and navigated through a whiteout using a mental map she had built in 3 days. He thought about the absolute steadiness in her voice when she told him to sit down. He thought about how that steadiness had felt less like an affront to his authority and more like the first genuinely interesting thing that had happened to him in years. In the morning, the blizzard had settled to a deep, cold calm, the kind that comes after the storm has spent itself entirely. The world outside was white and silent and completely transformed. Cyrus was up before dawn, and he did something he had never once done in 6 years of living in that cabin. He found the long-handled shovel and cleared a path from his door to the woodshed, and then extended it to the edge of the tree line, giving the approach a clear and passable surface. He had always just walked through whatever the storm left behind. He had never had a reason to clear a path for anyone. He stood in the clean, cold air looking at what he had done and was briefly troubled by what it meant. Evelyn appeared in the doorway wrapped in his spare blanket, watching him. She had braided her dark hair, and the gash on her temple was crusted clean. She looked in the pale morning light like someone from a painting, except that no painting he had ever seen captured that quality of absolute contained intelligence. "You cleared the path," she said. "Easier to see the approach if someone tries to come up it." She considered this. "That is practical." "Yes," he said, and neither of them mentioned that the path went to the woodshed and not to the canyon road, and was not particularly useful as a defensive observation position. She came inside and made breakfast without asking, moving around his kitchen with an efficiency that suggested she had spent considerable time in field conditions where every movement had to have a purpose. She found his supply of flour and his salt pork and his coffee, and she produced something organized and warm from all of it, and Cyrus ate across the table from her and experienced the strange sensation of his cabin feeling less like a place where he lived and more like a place where something was happening. "You cannot go back to Ridgecrest today," he said. "I know that. Pruitt's men will be watching the road." "I know that as well." She cupped her coffee. "What I need is to complete the survey. My preliminary calculations already suggest the optimal route runs through the Alderman Pass, which is entirely outside Pruitt's claimed territory. But I need the theodolite measurements to prove it in a form the survey office and the railroad will accept." She looked out the frost-edged window. "I have my equipment in the second trunk at the boarding house. Getting that trunk out of Ridgecrest without Pruitt's men noticing is a problem. Getting the trunk is not the hardest problem." She looked at him directly. "The hardest problem is that I cannot do a full survey of the Northern Canyon District alone. I need someone who knows this country to carry equipment and hold survey rods and navigate the terrain safely. The man I had hired for that purpose quit before I arrived, almost certainly under Pruitt's influence." "You are asking me." She did not look away. "I am informing you of the situation. You can help or not as you choose, but I would like you to know that what I am trying to do matters beyond my commission. If Pruitt controls that railroad route through his land claims, the smaller ranchers and homesteaders in this district will be at his mercy for transport access for decades. Your eastern pasture land would be effectively landlocked without his permission to cross." Cyrus set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I will get your trunk." She nodded once. "I will draw you a map of the boarding house layout." He almost smiled. "I know where the boarding house is. You know the exterior. I mean the interior, so you know which room is mine and can access the trunk without going to the front desk, where Pruitt almost certainly has someone watching." She was already up and looking for paper and a pencil. He sat back and watched her sketch the interior layout of the Ridgecrest boarding house from 3 days of memory, with an accuracy that would have impressed a military intelligence officer. And he thought, not for the last time, that he was dealing with someone genuinely extraordinary. Getting the trunk took most of the day. Cyrus went into Ridgecrest on horseback through the snow, his cattle dog Ajax running quiet beside him, and he used the back alley entrance to the boarding house that Evelyn had marked on her sketch map. And he came back with the survey trunk strapped to a borrowed pack mule he had persuaded old Jensen to lend him for what he described only as a hauling job. 3 men were watching the main road out of Ridgecrest. He came back on the canyon track that ran north of the tree line, a route he had used for 6 years, and that was not on any available map, because it required knowing exactly where the limestone shelf went soft and where it would hold a horse's weight. When he came back to the cabin with the trunk, Evelyn was waiting. She had reorganized his interior space in his absence in ways he could not entirely identify, but that left the room feeling more efficiently arranged. She had also identified and repaired a gap in the chimney flashing that had been letting cold air into the upper room, using materials she had found in his supply shed. He stood in his own cabin doorway and looked at what she had done with his space in the 6 hours he had been gone. "The flashing," she said, following his gaze. "The heat loss through that gap was significant. I hope you do not mind that I addressed it. It has been like that since I built the place." "I know. I can tell from the soot patterns on the interior wall above the hearth." He brought the trunk inside. She opened it with a key she wore on a cord around her neck and removed the theodolite from its case with the careful reverence of a craftsman handling a precision tool. It was a beautiful instrument, polished brass and glass, and she assembled it onto its tripod with a speed and surety that made it clear she had done this hundreds of times. She looked up and found him watching her, and the expression on his face made her pause. It was not a man watching a woman doing something unusual. It was a man watching someone do something at the highest possible level and being struck by it the way you are struck by watching a master do anything, whether it is roping cattle or playing the piano or navigating by starlight. Pure, uncomplicated, genuine awe. "You have not seen a theodolite before," she said. "I have seen one. I have not seen one handled like that." She looked at the instrument and then back at him. "My father taught me. He said there was no point teaching me anything unless he taught me properly." "He was right," Cyrus said simply. She was quiet for a moment. People did not usually say that. People usually said something qualified, something that acknowledged her skill while leaving room for doubt about whether it was truly the equal of a man's. Cyrus said it the way he said everything, directly, without qualification, as though the statement required no decoration because it was simply true. "We will need clear weather for the measurements," she said, because she did not know what else to do with the warmth that had moved through her chest. "Tomorrow looks clear," he said. Wind dropped. "Cold will hold the snow. Then we begin tomorrow." They began tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. The survey of the Northern Canyon District took 11 days in total, and those 11 days were among the most extraordinary of Cyrus Carson's life, and he suspected, though he would not have said it yet, the same was true for Evelyn Aldridge. She was extraordinary in the field. He had expected competence because she had demonstrated nothing less since the moment she walked through his door. But in the terrain, with the theodolite and the survey rod and her notebooks and the mathematical instruments she carried in a canvas roll like a surgeon's tools, she was something beyond competent. She was brilliant. She saw the land in a way that was almost separate from physical observation, as though she were reading a language written in elevation and drainage and geological formation that most people did not know existed. On the third day, standing on a limestone shelf above the upper canyon, she sighted the theodolite on a reference mark Cyrus had driven into the rock face on the opposite slope, and made a set of measurements that required him to hold perfectly still with the survey rod for 4 minutes in a biting north wind. He held. She measured. She recorded the numbers in her notebook, and then sat back and stared at the canyon below them, with an expression he had come to recognize as the face she made when she was assembling information into a picture. "The Alderman Pass routing is definitively superior," she said, without preamble. "The grade difference over 12 miles is 42 feet. No railroad engineer in his right mind would prefer Pruitt's route once they see these numbers." "He will not go quietly," Cyrus said. "No. But he will go legally, which is all I require." She closed the notebook. "The law can be slow and corrupt and imperfect, but a certified survey filed with the Federal Land Office and the railroad company simultaneously creates a record that is extremely difficult to bury. You have done this before." She smiled, and it was the first full smile he had seen from her, and it was devastating in its warmth. "Land fraud is not unique to Wyoming. I dealt with a similar situation in Colorado 2 years ago. Different men, same pattern. They always believe that if the correct data disappears, they win. They forget that the person who gathered the data does not disappear quite so easily." Cyrus looked at her on that frozen limestone shelf, with the canyon spread below them and the sky achingly blue above, and felt the lock in his chest, the one that had been there since Clara and Thomas Hale, and the deed he should never have signed over, shift in a way he had not expected and could not quite control. He looked away and stood up. "We should make the next station before the light goes." "Yes," she agreed and stood up as well, and neither of them said anything about what had just passed between them, because neither of them was yet ready to name it. The danger did not wait for them to be ready. On the 7th day of the survey, they came back to the cabin to find that someone had been inside. Nothing was taken, but certain things had been moved with deliberate subtlety, the kind of subtle that is meant to be noticed. A drawer left a 1/4 inch open, a book tilted on the shelf, a thread that Evelyn had set across the base of the survey trunk, a habit she had developed in the field, snapped clean. "They wanted us to know they had been here," she said. Cyrus stood in the center of his own cabin with a cold fury that was entirely controlled and therefore more dangerous than rage. Pruitt is escalating. He is becoming desperate. The survey is nearly complete and he likely knows it. Someone in Ridgecrest is reporting our movements. She looked at him. "We need to complete the final measurements tomorrow and get the data to the telegraph office before he can act. The telegraph office in Ridgecrest, which Pruitt's people will be watching. There is a telegraph relay station at Fort Pemberton," he said, 17 miles north. I know the route." She was already at the table with her notebook. "If we leave at first light and complete the final survey station on the way, we can be at Fort Pemberton by early afternoon." He sat down across from her and they planned together, leaning over her notebook in the firelight, their heads close enough that he could smell the cold air still in her hair. And at some point that evening, without either of them deciding it exactly, the planning gave way to talking. She told him about her father, the naturalist, who had died of a fever in the New Mexico territory when she was 22, leaving her alone and fully trained and possessed of credentials that half the institutions she applied to refused to take seriously. She told him about the survey office in Denver, the director who had looked at her work and hired her not because he was a progressive man, but because he was a practical one who recognized exceptional skill. She told him about the loneliness of traveling always, of never staying long enough to see the season change, of building her entire life around the forward motion of the next commission. He listened in a way that very few people had ever listened to her, without waiting for his turn to speak, without looking for an opening to diminish what she was saying with a comparison to something he had experienced. He simply listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he told her about Thomas Hale and Clara and the deed, and it was the first time he had told that story to anyone since moving to Wyoming. She listened the same way he had listened, fully, without judgment. "You were not naive," she said when he finished. "You trusted someone you had reason to trust. The failure was theirs, not yours. Most people would say I should have known better." Most people confuse cynicism with intelligence. She looked at him steadily. Trusting someone completely is not a character flaw. It is the only way that love is actually love and not a transaction. The word love fell into the space between them and sat there undisturbed. Cyrus looked at the fire for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "You are going to finish this survey and send the data and then move on to the next commission." It was not quite a question. She held his gaze. "That is what I have always done." "Do you want to keep doing it?" The question surprised her. She could see that it surprised her, the small change in her expression that she could not quite control. She looked down at her notebook and then back up at him. "I have not asked myself that in a long time," she said honestly. He nodded, and then he stood and said he was going to check the horses, and he went outside into the cold night, and he stood under the stars with his breath fogging in the air, and his heart doing something complicated that he did not have experience managing. The next morning they left before dawn. The final survey station was at the head of Alderman Pass, 1,000 feet above the canyon floor, and the work was meticulous and cold and took 3 hours. But when Evelyn closed her notebook and secured the theodolite in its case with the small, satisfied click of a task completed perfectly, Cyrus felt it in his own chest like a resolved chord. "That is everything," she said. "I have what I need." They were heading back down the pass trail toward the Fort Pemberton track when Cyrus's horse, a solid bay named Ranger, threw his head up and stopped. Cyrus pulled up immediately. He held up his hand and Evelyn stopped her horse behind him without being told to. They had learned each other's signals in 11 days with the efficiency of people who move through dangerous country together and need to communicate without speaking. 3 riders coming up the track from the south. Still below them, perhaps 200 yards, moving through the pine trees. "Prewitt's men," Cyrus said quietly. "Almost certainly." Evelyn was already scanning the terrain with the precision of someone assessing survey conditions. Her eyes moved up to a granite shelf 30 yards to their right, elevated above the trail, with a clear sight line in both directions. "Up there. If we take the horses up that draw on the left, there is enough flat ground behind the shelf to hold them. You have been up that draw before. I surveyed it on day 4. She was already moving her horse toward the draw, and Cyrus followed, because in 11 days he had come to trust her spatial knowledge of this country with a completeness he would not have thought himself capable of 2 weeks earlier. They got the horses up and behind the granite shelf, and Cyrus ground-tied them and came to crouch beside Evelyn, who was already watching the trail through a gap in the rock. The 3 riders came up the main track. They were moving slowly, reading the snow for tracks. They found the place where Cyrus and Evelyn had left the trail, and one of them pointed up the draw. Evelyn put her hand on Cyrus's arm. He looked at her. "Do not fire first," she said quietly. "If they think we came up here because we are trapped, they will split up to flank us and we will be in a worse position. If they think we came up here to observe them, they will stay together and stay on the trail." He processed this. "How do we make them think that?" She reached into the survey trunk, which was strapped across the pack horse, and removed the theodolite. She set it up on the granite shelf, fully visible from the trail below, and sighted it toward the northern horizon, making no effort to conceal herself. The 3 men on the trail below stopped dead. They looked at the woman standing on a granite shelf above them, operating a brass survey instrument in the open air. And then they looked at each other. And then they looked at the man standing beside her, who was not quite pointing a rifle at them, but was holding it in a way that made his capabilities entirely clear. Evelyn called down, her voice carrying cleanly in the cold air with the calm authority of someone who is entirely in control of the situation. I am completing a federally commissioned survey of this district. I have witnesses to your approach. Any interference with a federal survey is a criminal offense under the Land Survey Act of 1872. I suggest you return to Mr. Pruitt and inform him that the survey is complete." The three men held their position for 30 seconds that felt much longer. Then, without a word among them that Cyrus could hear, they turned their horses and went back down the trail. Cyrus watched them go. Then he looked at Evelyn. She was already breaking down the theodolite with those efficient, practiced hands. "That was a bluff," he said. "Most of it," she agreed. "The part about the Land Survey Act is accurate. The part about witnesses was less so." He stared at her. "You set up the theodolite to make them think you were performing an official act in view of witnesses." "I was performing an official act. I simply made sure they saw it." She clicked the instrument case closed. "Men like that operate on intimidation. The moment you demonstrate that you are not afraid and that you have official standing, they have to calculate whether eliminating you is worth the legal exposure. In most cases, it is not." Cyrus was silent for a long moment. Then he said in a voice that was very quiet and very certain, "That was the most impressive thing I have ever seen anyone do." She looked up at him, and this time she did not look away from the warmth in his eyes. She held it, and something in her, the part that had learned to keep moving to avoid feeling the full weight of aloneness, went very still. "We should get to Fort Pemberton," she said, but her voice was not quite as steady as usual. "Yes," he agreed, and neither of them moved for a moment. They rode to Fort Pemberton and sent the telegraph to the survey office in Denver and to the Northern Pacific Railroad's Denver office simultaneously. Evelyn's field notes, compiled into a summary of findings, were copied by the fort's telegraph operator and sent in full. The fort's commander, a Lieutenant Graves who was politely astonished by a woman surveyor and had the good sense not to say so, provided written documentation of the filing time and the content of the transmissions. By the time Pruitt became aware of what had happened, it was already a federal matter. The ride back from Fort Pemberton was long and cold and darkening toward evening, and they rode side by side when the trail was wide enough, and Cyrus found himself doing what he had not done since he was young enough not to know better, which was looking forward to the sound of another person's voice. "What happens now?" he asked. "The survey office will forward my findings to the land office. The railroad will make their route decision based on the engineering data. Pruitt will likely challenge it through legal channels, but the record is clean and the data is verifiable, so he will not succeed." She paused. "In the meantime, I am a liability to remain in Ridgecrest. I should find accommodations elsewhere while the legal process moves forward." "Elsewhere," he said. She looked at him sidelong. "I cannot impose on you indefinitely." "You are not imposing." He said it without hesitation, without the qualifications that most people attach to hospitality to leave themselves room to withdraw it. "You are welcome for as long as you need." She was quiet for a long time. The horses moved through the darkening snow. "Cyrus," she said, and the sound of his name in her voice was different from any way he had heard his name spoken before, careful and warm at once, like someone handling something they do not want to damage. "Yes. I need you to understand something about me." She kept her eyes forward. "I have been self-sufficient since I was 22 years old. I have not allowed anyone to take care of me in any meaningful way in 4 years because every time I have allowed that, I have lost something, my position, my professional credibility, once nearly my life. I am not good at accepting help without cost-benefit analysis." He considered this. "And what does your cost-benefit analysis say about staying at my cabin?" She glanced at him. Something in her expression was carefully unguarded. "It says the costs are not the kind I am accustomed to calculating." They came back to the cabin in the full dark, and Cyrus fed the horses and checked the woodshed. And when he came inside, Evelyn had the fire going and supper started, and the cabin was warm and lit, and felt the way he imagined a home was supposed to feel, not the way it had felt in the 6 years he had been living in it alone. He stood in the doorway of his own home and understood, clearly and without the usual flinching, that he was in love with Evelyn Aldridge. He understood also that she was a woman who would leave, that her whole life had been structured around leaving, and that telling her what he felt would require a courage different from anything he had used before, because the worst thing was not that she might not feel the same. The worst thing was that she might feel exactly the same and leave anyway, because she had built a life on motion and had not yet learned how to stop. He went inside and ate supper with her, and they talked about the land, about the canyon country she had been mapping, about the geology of limestone shelf formation, and the particular way freeze-thaw cycles created the terrain features that made the Alderman Pass route so much more efficient than Pruitt's. She talked about it with a joy that she did not always show, the pure intellectual pleasure of a person who loves what they do, and he listened and asked questions and watched her face in the firelight and stored everything she said in a part of himself that was not going to let go. The legal process moved faster than either of them expected. The survey office in Denver moved quickly once they received the telegraph, because a case involving deliberate interference with a federal survey commission was exactly the kind of thing the Federal Land Office wanted to resolve cleanly. A federal agent, a man named Hargrove, arrived in Ridgecrest 8 days after the telegraph was sent, and Arthur Pruitt's operation began to unravel with the particular swiftness of things that have been built on fraudulent foundations. 2 of Pruitt's men provided testimony in exchange for reduced charges. The 3 men who had followed Evelyn on the night of the blizzard were identified. The land claims that Pruitt had filed using falsified survey data from the previous surveyor, the one who had been persuaded to quit, were invalidated. Pruitt himself was arrested and transported to Cheyenne to face federal charges. Evelyn was required to travel to Ridgecrest twice to give formal testimony before the federal agent, and Cyrus accompanied her both times, riding into town with her and waiting with the calm, watchful presence of a man who has decided what he is responsible for. The people in Ridgecrest who saw them together drew their own conclusions, and Evelyn heard the whispers and did not correct them, which she noticed herself doing and found interesting. On the evening after the second testimony, riding back to the cabin in the clean, cold air of early January, Evelyn said abruptly, "My next commission is in Nevada. The survey office wants me to map a water rights dispute near the Carson River." "Nevada," Cyrus said. "February. The commission begins February 15th. He was quiet for 2 full minutes, long enough that Evelyn, who was very good at reading silences, began to hear things in his that she was not sure she had prepared for. "It is a significant commission," she said. "Water rights in Nevada are going to define a great deal of agricultural development in the territory. I know. It is important work. I know that too." He stopped Ranger on the trail and she stopped her horse beside him, and they were level with each other in the moonlit snow, and he turned to look at her with dark eyes that were not quiet now at all. They were full of everything he had been carrying for 6 weeks. "I need to say something to you, and I want you to let me finish before you respond." She waited. "I have been alone for 6 years by choice," he said. "Not because I did not want company, but because I decided that the risk of trusting someone again was not worth what it cost me the last time. I built that cabin and that cattle operation and that life with the specific intention of needing no one." He paused. "Then you walked through my door in the worst blizzard of the year and told me to sit down, and I sat down, and I have been trying to figure out for 6 weeks why that felt like relief instead of defeat." She said nothing. She was listening. "I am in love with you, Evelyn," he said. "I know that you have built a life on moving forward. I know that you have reasons for that as legitimate as my reasons for staying still. I'm not asking you to give up Nevada or the survey work or any part of who you are. I would not ask you to do that any more than you would ask me to stop being who I am." He held her gaze. "But I am asking you not to leave without knowing it, because I think you deserve to make that choice with all the information." The cold air was very still. Above them the stars were extraordinary, the way they are in January in Wyoming when the sky has been scoured clean by winter. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was different from any way he had heard it, which was saying something, because he had spent 6 weeks cataloging the ways she spoke. "I have been a surveyor since I was 17 years old," she said. "I have measured more land than most men will ever walk across. I have calculated distances and elevations and gradients with a precision that accounts for the curvature of the earth." She stopped. "And I have been completely incapable of calculating the distance between who I have been and who I might be capable of becoming, because I did not have a reference point." She looked at him with those green eyes that had assessed his entire cabin in 30 seconds on the worst night of the year and found it worth staying in. "You are a reference point, Cyrus." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and she let him, and they rode back to the cabin like that in the moonlight, hands linked across the cold air. And when they reached the door, he got down first and helped her down without her needing to be helped, which is to say, he simply offered the gesture and she accepted it because she wanted to, not because she required it. He had cleared the path to his door weeks ago. He never closed it again. January gave way to February, and the question of Nevada was not resolved quickly, because nothing between Evelyn and Cyrus was resolved without the full and honest engagement that both of them brought to every other thing in their lives. She sent a letter to the survey office in Denver requesting a delay in the Nevada Commission. She cited the ongoing legal proceedings in Ridgecrest, which were genuine, as grounds for a 60-day postponement. The survey office granted it. She did this on her own without being asked, and told Cyrus about it afterward, not as a declaration of permanence, but as an acknowledgement that she was choosing, deliberately and with full awareness, to remain. He thanked her without making it more than it needed to be. He was a man who understood the value of not overwhelming a moment with too much language. In those 2 months, they learned each other. Not in the compressed intensity of the blizzard and the survey and the danger, but in the ordinary dailiness of shared life, which is in many ways the more demanding test. Evelyn learned that Cyrus was meticulous about his animals in a way that reflected a genuine tenderness he did not otherwise display easily. She learned that he read, genuinely and seriously. The books on his shelf were not decorative but worn and annotated. She learned that he had a dry humor that required attention to catch, but that was unfailingly precise, and that making him laugh fully, not the controlled nearly smile but actual laughter, became something she worked toward with the same focused intention she brought to a difficult survey calculation. Cyrus learned that Evelyn's independence was not a wall but a foundation, that she did not keep people out because she did not want them in, but because she had learned the hard way that most people could not handle what she was. He learned that she was capable of a warmth and softness she kept carefully rationed, not because she was cold, but because she valued what she gave and wanted to give it to someone who understood its worth. He learned that she made decisions the way she made measurements, with care and precision and absolute commitment once the decision was made. He learned that when she looked at him, she was seeing him with the same thorough attention she gave the land, and that being fully seen by someone who is that genuinely perceptive was the most terrifying and complete feeling he had ever had. In late February, on a clear afternoon when the cold had eased enough for a long ride, Evelyn proposed that they resurvey a section of Cyrus's eastern pasture boundary, because the existing markers were inconsistent with the actual terrain features, and she suspected the original survey had been done poorly, which was a problem that could affect his land claim in a legal dispute. Cyrus held the survey rod and she ran the theodolite, and they worked through the afternoon in the clean, cold air, and at the end of it she showed him the corrected boundary, which added 43 acres to his legally defensible claim on the eastern side, exactly the 43 acres that Prewitt had been most interested in acquiring. He stared at her notes. Then he stared at her. "You did this for me," he said. I did this because it was the correct thing to do, and because your land claim deserves to reflect accurate data." She began packing up the theodolite. "Also because I love you, but that is incidental." She said it with the same directness and precision she said everything, and the matter-of-fact quality of it was so exactly Evelyn that he felt it go through him like a clean, bright current. He put down the survey rod and crossed to her and took her face in both his hands, carefully, the way you handle something of extraordinary value, and she stopped packing the theodolite and looked up at him, and he kissed her there in the corrected pasture boundary of the eastern land claim, with the Wyoming mountains all around them and the cold sky overhead. She kissed him back with the same decisive completeness she brought to everything, and when they separated she said, with the smallest curve at the corner of her mouth, "I believe that is the correct bearing." He laughed fully, the real laugh that she had been working toward for weeks, and she smiled at the sound of it with an expression she did not try to moderate. The Nevada Commission was formally transferred to another surveyor. Evelyn sent the letter herself, with a note to the survey office director explaining that she was establishing a permanent base of operations in the Wyoming territory and would be available for commissions within the region. The director wrote back expressing mild surprise and complete professional respect and assigning her 3 Wyoming district commissions for the coming year. She told Cyrus about the letter and the response over supper in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for survey data, and he was quiet for a moment. "Permanent," he said. "That is the word I used, yes. Then I think we should formalize the arrangement." She looked at him. "Are you proposing marriage, Cyrus Carson?" "I am stating my intention to propose marriage," he said. "The actual proposal requires more preparation than I currently have." She considered this. "What kind of preparation?" "The kind that involves a ring and a question asked properly." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I should tell you that I have a strong preference for meaningful over decorative." "I know," he said. "I have been paying attention." The ring he found was in his mother's estate effects, which he had carried with him from Texas in a small tin box that had traveled all the way to Wyoming unopened. It had been his mother's grandmother's ring, a simple band of gold set with a single garnet the deep red of autumn leaves, and it was small and exact and old, and it was precisely the most meaningful and least decorative ring he could have offered her. He proposed in the field. Specifically, on the limestone shelf above the upper canyon, where she had told him on day 3 of the survey that the Alderman Pass routing was definitively superior, because it was the place where he had first understood completely what she was, and had been struck by it with that reorganizing awe that had never quite left him. He said that he loved her and that he respected every part of her, the intelligence and the independence and the capability, and the willingness to suture her own wounds in the mountains, and the way she thought about the land with that precise and joyful attention. He said he was not asking her to be less than she was, but to let him be alongside her for as long as they had. She said yes, without qualification, with the full, committed precision of a measurement she had checked from every angle and found to be exactly accurate. They were married in Ridgecrest in March of 1883, in the small church on the main street, by the same minister who had been conducting services there for 12 years, and who had never once married a couple where the bride was carrying a surveyor's notebook in her coat pocket, because she intended to do field work on the way back from the ceremony. He was charmed by it. The town of Ridgecrest turned out in greater numbers than either of them expected, which reflected less a great social investment in Cyrus and Evelyn personally, and more the significant reality that Evelyn's survey work and the subsequent federal action against Arthur Pruitt had freed the smaller ranchers and homesteaders in the district from a decade of land pressure they had been suffering quietly. Several of the men at the wedding shook Evelyn's hand with a seriousness that was the frontier equivalent of a standing ovation. Old Jensen, who had lent Cyrus the pack mule, gave a toast that was mostly incoherent but deeply felt. Ajax, the cattle dog, sat under the table for the entire reception and was given a significant amount of wedding cake, which Cyrus allowed because he was in a generous mood that day. They went back to the cabin that Cyrus had built, where the path to the door was still clear, and the chimney flashing was still tight because Evelyn had repaired it, and it had not let in a breath of cold air since. And they began the life that had been moving toward them since the first blizzard of the season had brought a woman with a rifle and a bleeding head wound, and a mind like a precision instrument through a stranger's door. In the spring, Evelyn conducted the first of her Wyoming district commissions, a survey of the southern range lands for the Territorial Land Office, and Cyrus worked the cattle operation and expanded the eastern pasture now that the corrected boundary was on record. They were often in the field together, because Cyrus had become, in the practical way of a man who learns quickly, a genuinely skilled field assistant, and because they were better together in the terrain than either of them was alone, which was not something either of them had expected when the winter started. By summer, the cabin that had been built for one felt full rather than crowded, which is a distinction that has everything to do with the quality of the person sharing the space. In October, Evelyn told him quietly, with the same directness she brought to everything, that she was expecting a child. He sat with that for a moment, not in the way of a man who is troubled, but in the way of a man who is so full of feeling he needs a second to let it settle. Then he put his arms around her, this woman who had walked into his life in a blizzard, and told him to sit down, and she let herself be held in the way she allowed very few things completely. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Quantifiably less frightened than I have been on many occasions in my professional career," she said against his shoulder, and he felt the smile in it. "That is a very Evelyn answer." "Yes," she agreed. "I am also very, very happy, which is less quantifiable and which I intend to simply experience." The winter of 1883 into 1884 was milder than the previous year, and they spent it in the cabin that no longer felt solitary, building the practical infrastructure of a life that was going to require more room. Cyrus added 2 rooms to the cabin structure with the same methodical care he had built the original, and Evelyn designed the layout because she had opinions about proportionality and natural light that were specific and correct, and the result was a home rather than a structure, with a study corner for her instruments and notebooks, and a broad south-facing window that let in the winter sun. Their son was born in April of 1884, in that same south-facing room, delivered by the local midwife, a formidable woman named Mrs. Hatch, who had been doing this work for 20 years, and who met Evelyn with the immediate recognition of one capable woman for another. They named him James Aldridge Carson, James for no particular reason except that it was solid and clear, and Aldridge because Evelyn's name deserved to continue, and because it would tell him something about who his mother was every time he heard it. James was a large and healthy boy with Cyrus's dark eyes, and Evelyn's incongruous expression of evaluating the world and finding it mostly acceptable, which at 3 weeks old should not have been possible to read in an infant, but was somehow unmistakable. Cyrus held his son in the evening light and looked at Evelyn, who was sitting up in the wide bed with her hair loose around her shoulders and a survey notebook open on her lap, because she had been thinking about a measurement problem and had not been willing to let it go even in the first days of new motherhood, and he felt something so complete that his chest ached with it. "You are doing mathematics," he said. "I am thinking about mathematics," she corrected, without looking up. "There is a distinction." Then she looked up and saw his expression, and the notebook closed. She looked at him with James in his arms. "Cyrus." "Yes." "I want you to know," she said, "that I chose this with full and clear intention, not because I had nowhere else to go, not because the blizzard left me no other option. I chose this cabin and this life and you, specifically and deliberately, with all the analytical rigor I bring to everything." She held his gaze. "I have never made a better supported decision in my professional or personal life." "High praise," he said, "from the finest surveyor in the Wyoming Territory." She smiled, and it was the full, warm smile, the one that she rationed carefully and gave to him with increasing frequency, and it lit the room more thoroughly than the lamp. "Arguably in the territory's plural," she said mildly. He laughed, and James, startled by the sound, opened his dark eyes very wide and looked at his father with an expression of absolute assessment, which was, Cyrus thought, entirely appropriate. The years that followed were full in the way of a life properly lived. Evelyn continued her survey work, managing commissions with a flexibility that the survey office in Denver came to expect and accommodate, because she was, as the director had privately admitted to a colleague, the best field surveyor they had contracted in 2 decades, and one did not manage a talent like that with rigid demands. She took commissions that were within practical distance of home, and occasionally took longer projects when James was old enough to stay with Cyrus or with Mrs. Hatch, who had become something close to family. Cyrus expanded the cattle operation steadily, adding a second pasture when the corrected land claims were fully recorded, and a small herd of horses that he found he had a patience for that surprised him. He also became, through proximity and genuine interest, something of a practical expert in land survey methodology, not at Evelyn's level, which was a level that remained specifically and impressively hers, but enough that he could read her notes and ask useful questions and understand what she was doing in the field with a depth that she valued. They argued because they were both people with strong views and the willingness to defend them, and their arguments were characterized by a mutual respect that meant they always ended in actual resolution rather than managed silence. She changed his mind about things and he changed hers, and both of them considered this one of the better features of the arrangement. When James was 2 years old, Evelyn's second pregnancy brought twin daughters, born in the late summer of 1886 with the same healthy intensity as their brother. They named the girls Catherine and Frances, Catherine for Evelyn's grandmother, Frances for no particular reason except that it fit. Cyrus held both daughters in the crook of one arm on the day they were born, and the midwife, Mrs. Hatch, told him she had never in 20 years seen a man look so simultaneously overwhelmed and completely in the right place. He brought Evelyn coffee while she was still in bed, and she drank it and looked at their 2 daughters and then at him and said, in the tone she used when something had genuinely surprised her, "I had not calculated for 2. "No," he agreed. "I am revising my models. Good idea." She looked at him with those green eyes that had assessed everything about him from the beginning and had kept finding him worth staying for. "I am going to need a larger study corner." "Already planned," he said. By 1888, the Ridgecrest district had changed significantly. The railroad spur along the Alderman Pass route had been constructed and was operational, connecting the Northern Canyon district to the main line at a station 12 miles south. Several new families had settled in the district, drawn by the improved transport access and by the resolution of the land claim disputes that had kept the area unstable. The town of Ridgecrest itself had grown, with a proper school and a new general store and a doctor's office that had been badly needed for years. Evelyn was known in the district, and beyond it, as the surveyor who had broken Prewitt's land fraud and whose maps of the Northern Canyon district were considered among the most accurate in territorial history. The survey office in Denver had used her methodology as a training standard. She had been invited to present her work at a Geological Society meeting in Denver, and had gone, with Cyrus and the children and 2 weeks' worth of careful logistics, and had given a presentation to a room full of male geologists and surveyors that had been received with the kind of sustained applause that represented genuine professional respect from people who knew what they were looking at. She had come home from Denver and stood in the cabin doorway and looked at the path to the door, which Cyrus kept clear through every winter now, a habit so established it required no thought, and she had said, "I am glad this is where I am." He had said, "So am I," and meant it with everything he had. James grew up understanding that women were capable of remarkable things because his mother was demonstrably remarkable and because his father never once framed it any other way. He grew up in a home where intelligence was valued, and honesty was non-negotiable, and hard work was expected, and love was not a subject of abstraction but a daily and visible practice. He grew up knowing the story of the blizzard, because it was their family's founding story. The night his mother walked through a stranger's door with a rifle and a head wound, and told the man who would become his father to sit down, and the man sat down, and his life reorganized itself accordingly. Catherine and Francis grew up with their mother's precision and their father's steadiness in varying combinations, and the home on the canyon edge was loud and warm and full of survey notebooks, and cattle records and arguments about mathematics and dogs underfoot and coffee that was always on. On the evening of December the 3rd, 1892, exactly 10 years after the blizzard that had brought Evelyn to Cyrus's door, he came in from the woodshed to find her standing at the south window looking out at the snow, which had been falling since morning. James was 9, the twins were 6, and all 3 children were in various stages of the organized chaos of an evening with nowhere to be. He stood beside her at the window and looked out at the snow. 10 years ago tonight, she said. Yes. I have been thinking about the variables that brought me to your door specifically. She looked at him sidelong. The blizzard had to be severe enough to drive me off the canyon road. Pruitt's men had to be far enough behind that I had time to find shelter. The cabin had to be within navigable distance of the tree line exit. Your survey notes had to have placed you in my reference memory. A great many things had to go exactly right, he agreed. Or exactly wrong, she said, depending on your perspective. He looked at her in the lamplight, this woman who had walked into his life with a rifle and a plan, and a mind that had never stopped moving in 10 years of mornings across the breakfast table, and he thought that there was no perspective from which any of it had gone wrong. I cleared the path, he said. I have never closed the door. She turned from the window and looked at him with those green eyes full of 10 years of chosen life, and she put her hand against his chest where she could feel his heart. No, she said, you never did. Outside, the snow fell clean and white over the canyon country of Wyoming, over the corrected boundary markers and the survey points, and the trail that ran north to the Alderman Pass, over the railroad tracks that ran where Evelyn's numbers said they should, over the home that a man had built with his hands, and a woman had made worth staying in. Inside, the fire was going and the coffee was on, and the children were loud, and the cattle dog was under the table, and the theodolite was in its case in the study corner, and the survey notebooks were stacked, and the rifle was above the mantel, and the garnet ring was on Evelyn's hand, and the path to the door was clear. It had been clear for 10 years. It would be clear for all the years that came after, because some doors, once open to the right person, lose the capacity for closing entirely, and the man who stands in the threshold of such a door, having cleared the path in a blizzard because something in him already knew, does not experience this as a loss. He experiences it as the truest and best thing he has ever built, which is saying something, for a man who built his own cabin in hard country from nothing, with his own hands, in the honest certainty that it would last. The winter of 1892 passed into spring, and the spring into summer, and the summer into the full bright autumn when the canyon country turned amber and gold and Evelyn ran a survey line along the northern ridge for the Territorial Land Office, and Cyrus brought the cattle down from the high pasture, and James helped with both operations in alternating days, because he was 9 years old and already convinced he could do anything, which was, given his parentage, a reasonable conviction. And the life they had built, in the canyon country of Wyoming, in the year and the decade and the turning world of the frontier that was slowly becoming something other than frontier, but had not yet lost its bone-deep quality of consequence, continued to be exactly what it was, full and difficult and extraordinary, and chosen every single day by two people who were not looking for each other when they found each other in the dark of the worst storm of the year, but who had recognized each other immediately and completely as the reference point the other had been missing, and had never looked away since.